Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner Fielding, for warming up our two distinguished guests today on this cold, frigid day in Washington. I know Professor Hyman couldn't make it because of, they say, 2 or 3 feet of snow. We hear from our friends up in Boston and New England, and it might have been 4 feet of snow. It gets bigger and bigger all the time, but we certainly appreciate both of you being here today. I want to follow up right away on one of Fred's questions and push Mr. Thompson a little bit harder here. Mr. Thompson, it might be said by critics of the FBI's performance prior to 9/11 that to sustain an intelligence gathering system that was devised back in 1947 with the separation of domestic and foreign gathering resources and this bright line, that is no longer sustainable in a 9/11 world with the terrorism we have. Professor Schulhofer has just indicated that he might, well, he's got a lot of questions like we all do, he might be open to something being put into the Department of, to the FBI. Let me throw 3 options out at you, and you tell me what you'd be more in favor of, but give me a couple more specific reasons why. The current status quo, creating something within the Department of FBI to help us gather this domestic intelligence information and create this better handoff without the stovepipes, or something within the Department of Justice. Again, trying to bring down the wall, trying to expand our capabilities to keep up with technology, trying to make sure that the Patriot Act reflects some of these challenges and opportunities. But certainly not going back to the status quo that we've had for the last 56 years.
Congressman, I agree that we shouldn't stay at the status quo, and that's unacceptable. Thinking about what you said, I believe, based on my experience in dealing with these issues, that we should proceed along the second alternative. And I know before I left, that's what Director Mueller was doing with a sense of great urgency. I know that there was created within the FBI an Office of Intelligence that reported to the assistant head of the FBI for counterterrorism, and that person now is an individual who has an intelligence background, which I think is terrific. There has been more effort being put into recruiting and training analysts, and that's something that we need to do. We need to continue to consider how we can create a career track for people within the FBI who are going to specialize in intelligence collection, who are going to specialize in analytical studies. So those are all the things that we need to be doing better. I think we're on the track to doing that. But on the other hand, I think we need to continue to make certain that the FBI and other organizations are working very closely together. We have stood up the TTIC, the Terrorist Threat Integration Center. I think that goes a long way toward doing some of the things that are so important, that are needed with respect to how we deal with terrorism. I have 30 years of law practice, and almost all that 30 years has been either as a prosecutor or as a defense lawyer. And as a defense lawyer, I know how important it is to maintain the balance that Mr. Fielding was talking about with respect to our important civil liberties. And while the FBI has made some mistakes in that area over the years, by and large, the thousands of men and women who are their special agents are trained to deal within the 4 corners of the Fourth Amendment, for example. They're trained to deal with legal issues. Many of our intelligence officials do not have that kind of training, and maybe they shouldn't have that kind of training with respect to what's required in intelligence. You need to be creative. But I think in terms of dealing with the domestic issues that the professor pointed out, dealing with the domestic issues as it relates to our counterterrorism efforts, it's very important to have an organization like the FBI that's been trained to deal within the confines of the law. In addition, it's very important to have an organization like the FBI that has this network of informants throughout the country who are bad guys and who know a lot about what's going on in their respective communities, and that in itself is a valuable repository for intelligence information. And just one other final point. We need to have this integration because there's a lot that can be done in the prevention area when you can leverage the possibility of a long prison sentence because someone has violated the law with cooperation. And with that cooperation, you're going to get the kind of intelligence if the person was engaged in terrorism activities that we need.
Thank you. Dr. Schulhofer, did you have anything you wanted to add subsequent to Mr. Thompson's answer there to your first one? Or?
Well, let me just try to be brief because I think I agree very largely with what he said. I think integration of this function is crucial. We have an enormous problem in this country because we have, I believe I saw a figure, 38,000 law enforcement agencies in this country. It's not like Britain or France or any other country. So even at the federal level, we're just scratching the surface of the necessary integration that you need with the NYPD and thousands of other police departments. I think the Terrorist Threat Integration Center, TTIC, is it? I've wondered how that one was pronounced. Is a beginning, but my understanding is that the way TTIC is structured, there is not a government official who has budgetary authority and agenda-setting authority over that. It's a working group among a number of big, heavy hitters, with nobody in charge. So I think it's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't really integrate as much. It doesn't integrate, and we need something of that nature which really is integrated, and that you maybe need to have someone like above the Director of Central Intelligence who's in charge of the counterterrorism function. Lastly, I would just say that I'm delighted we're talking about this, and part of my concern was that all the debate about the Patriot Act, as important as it is, has been diverting attention from things like this, which are so much more difficult and so much more important. They don't get the public attention of library borrowing and things like that, but this is really where the action is, and it's part of the reason why I kind of bristle when I hear talk about the Patriot Act, because yes or no, whether the issues are right or wrong, they're really not the ones that we should be most concerned to talk about.
Let me now follow up on a question that goes directly to the heart and soul of our mandate on this 9/11 Commission, and that is what happened prior to 9/11. We're supposed to write the definitive accounting of the terrorist action and the government's activities leading up to September 11th as well. And I think from your book, Professor, The Enemy Within, a Century Foundation report, you bring up this resources question over and over again, that you believe that the need for additional resources might even be greater than the need for additional legal authorities in battling terrorism. And we have Mr. Thompson here from the Justice Department. I want to put out a quote from your book and have you both respond to it if you would. Quote, "Yet on September 10th, in a political environment that gave high priority to shrinking big government, Attorney General Ashcroft rejected an FBI request for an additional $58 million to fund a strengthening of its counterterrorism effort," unquote. We have a Department of Justice, former Department of Justice official here that might be able to shed some light on that accusation from Professor Schulhofer. Mr. Thompson, do you have any recollection of that request for a $58 million increase in the counterterrorism budget? And then we'll have Professor Schulhofer tell us a little bit more about his perspective on that.
My recollection, Congressman, is that took place in the give and take of developing a budget. And there's a process, and Commissioner Gorelick is well aware of this process, of a component coming in with a certain request for funds, and leadership in the Department of Justice sort of negotiating with that component for the right level of funding. But as I recall, and this is just my present recollection, as I recall, that September 10th situation evolved in the context of the developing of the department's budget. I think what's more important, though, is that following the attacks of September 11th, the department's budget for counterterrorism efforts increased dramatically, and as well as the FBI's budget for counterterrorism. So I think we should focus more on what happened in terms of what happened to the budget after 9/11 and when the budget was finalized. But one other point, and that is this. Those of us who've been involved in federal law enforcement for a number of years have been concerned about the fact that federal law enforcement resources have traditionally been stretched thin, and have been stretched thin as we ebb and flow in terms of the various social and law enforcement priorities we've had in this country. In the 80s, when I was in the Department of Justice, there was a great desire to push the FBI into drug enforcement. There have been other times where the FBI has been pushed into more violent crime areas. There have been times that it's been pushed into public corruption. And we're going to continue to have to deal with the fact that the not only just the FBI, but all of federal law enforcement has limited resources, and we have to be very smart with respect to how we're going to deploy those. And I think right now we've deployed them in a way that focuses on the fact that terrorism is our #1 law enforcement priority. I think that Director Mueller has done a great job in deploying those resources to deal with terrorism. And I agree with the professor that we will need to continue to look at resources and to make certain that our law enforcement officials have adequate resources to do the job.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. As a supporter when I was in Congress of the Balanced Budget Act, I fully support the proposition that we don't have unlimited resources and we have to make tough decisions and not go into deficit spending. Professor, you say that the FBI could have used this for analytical capabilities, of more available personnel, better computer quality, translation capabilities, $58 million prior to September 10th. Would that have been helpful? And in your response, why was that proposal rejected?
Well, first of all, I'd like to be clear, just in case there is anyone listening who might misunderstand my point. I certainly do not think that the result would have been different the following morning if the Attorney General had made the other decision. That particular decision by the Attorney General did not contribute in any way. What I do think is that the decision was symptomatic of an attitude that pervaded the Justice Department during the first 9 months of the Bush administration, and I believe it also pervaded the Justice Department in the previous administration, an attitude that was both consisted of very limited, very thin, very widely stretched resources, and the wrong set of, what we can see in retrospect at least, tragically inaccurate set of priorities. Now, the second one has been fixed. It was fixed within hours after September 11th. We don't have to worry anymore about people not paying attention. But the problem of inadequate resources, in my judgment, has not been fixed. I would say, by the way, that I would want to acknowledge, as Larry Thompson said, that immediately after September 11th, there was a dramatic increase in Justice Department resources. In fact, I was looking for this and I found it. I thank you for referring to my book, and
Yeah, I thought I'd hold it up for you again, just to make a plug
sure it's
for the
on
Century
screen.
Foundation. And
but I found
good
on
not-for-profit world out there.
yes, it is a not-for-profit and not for royalties, but it is out there. On page 1 of my book, I mentioned the dramatic increase in resources that has occurred since September 11th. That was on page 1. But I do believe that we need to do a great deal more. And I hear mixed messages. In part, I was glad to hear Larry Thompson say that we need to keep looking at it. But I also heard, I believe, a sense that we have to accept the fact that resources are going to be limited and that we have to make choices. I don't accept it. Of course, to some degree, they're always going to be limited, but I don't accept the fact that we're at the right baseline now. I don't think we are, either in terms of the Justice Department itself or in terms of the Department of Homeland Security, which has the main mission of trying to address the soft targets. And if you read the DHS strategy document for protection of critical infrastructure, and that's something I realize is not part of our panel, but in my mind, you can't separate the civil liberties issues from the alternative ways of buying security. Right. And if the Commission takes a good look at that strategy document, as I would encourage you to do, I believe you'll see that there are no real choices made.
Absolutely, Professor. Let me stop you there because I do want to get a couple more questions in. We did look at this critical infrastructure report last month prior to a set of hearings. And there is a drastic paucity of the administration, both the previous administration, the current administration, and the legislative branch's inability to make these priorities, whether they be toward border issues, container issues, nuclear power plants, chemical plants, and assess what has been made safer since 2001. We don't have that kind of qualitative measurement right now in place. Let me go back to something that Fred brought up a couple minutes ago, but I don't think we got to the bottom of, and that's this issue of administrative subpoenas. The President has said to Congress that they need to pass a statute that would give the FBI this administrative subpoena power in anti-terrorism investigations. The FBI, as you both know, already has this power of issuing the national security letters. I think most Americans don't know much about these national security letters. They know a lot about the ability under Section 215 to possibly go and get library records, but they don't know in a FBI field office in any city in the country that the FBI can write internally in that field office in Indianapolis, Indiana, my home state, a national security letter. It doesn't need approval from anybody other than the special agent in charge in that office in Indianapolis. I don't think that there's judicial review of that procedure. That can entail telephone records of an individual. Maybe more Americans are concerned about their telephone records and the security and sensitivity of those than they are about what they're reading at the library. I don't know. That might be a case for debate. Let me ask the question to you. Do you believe that the existing national security letter authority is inadequate and that the FBI does need this additional administrative subpoena power? And why? Mr. Thompson?
Yes, Congressman. There have been instances in which the national security letters have proven inadequate to get the requested information, to obtain the requested information in a timely manner. And that's what's important here, getting information in a timely manner. And that's why
Mr. Thompson, just be specific to me in terms of timely manner. I outlined how quickly a national security letter can go through a field office. The agent writes it. He only has to go to his the supervised special agent in charge. Can happen, my understanding, pretty quickly. Why is timing something that would be important to you in this?
Because of the resistance of the person who is, because of the objection, if you will, of the person who is to provide the information. And
The objection of the
recipient.
The recipient, in this case, the telephone company?
Or
Whoever.
whomever, correct.
My understanding is the telephone company hands this over pretty quickly.
Well, I'm just giving you my recollection as to why the administrative subpoenas are needed.
Okay.
And it makes no sense why the FBI cannot have administrative subpoena authority to conduct investigations as it relates to terrorism when it does have that authority in any number of other areas. For example, it has that authority to conduct, to use administrative subpoenas in healthcare fraud investigations. And again, getting back to what you and the professor mentioned with respect to safeguards and accountability, as you know, an administrative subpoena, while it is believed that an administrative subpoena in certain situations would enable the FBI to get information in a more rapid manner, important information quicker. These subpoenas are not self-executing, and if the recipient objects, they are subject to challenge in court. But
So
it seems to me, as someone who looked at this in my previous position, that it makes no sense for the FBI and law enforcement not to have that arrow in its quiver with respect to the tools that are available to conduct terrorism investigations when it has that authority in a whole variety of areas. I don't recall the number, but there were multiple areas in which federal law enforcement agencies have the ability to utilize administrative subpoenas, and it simply makes no sense not to have that available to conduct terrorism investigations.
So who would approve the issuance of this, Mr. Thompson, the administrative subpoena? And how do we prevent against, how do we make sure there are safeguards so that these are not abused?
Well, typically the way they are dealt with in the non-terrorism matters is that the FBI works hand in hand with an assistant United States attorney, and the administrative subpoenas are issued.
Professor, you argue again in your book, I won't mention the name since you've already got plenty of publicity on it. On page 30, you talk about, and I quote, there's been an expansion of the government access to private information with little intelligence value and enlarges powers to investigate offenses entirely unrelated to terrorism, unquote. You talk about financial records, educational records, personnel files, email. Can you be a little bit more specific about how you would approach this issue of national security letters and the administrative subpoenas, checks and balances here, and whether or not we need those?
Right. I think that national security letters, as your question implied, have far fewer safeguards. They don't have zero because there does have to be a certain amount of paperwork, but they have far fewer safeguards than we normally require for the subpoena of personal records held by a third party. Normally, the person who's concerned, the owner of the records or the person to whom the records relate, would have the opportunity to object to the subpoena and to question its relevance. And the national security letter short circuits that process, and in fact it typically prohibits the holder of the records from notifying the person concerned that their records have been subpoenaed by and turned over to the government. There are circumstances.
And Professor, can you be clear on that then? Can you emphasize? So state that again, in an instance where you're trying to get this information under the national security letter and you go specifically to the telephone company to request an individual's telephone records, the telephone company does not have to inform that individual, that American citizen, that they have cooperated with the FBI and released those personal records. Is that correct?
That's correct. I
And
believe
in the other case, they do have to inform the individual. Is that correct?
I believe it's even worse than that. It's not simply that they don't have to inform the person. They're prohibited by law from informing the
And
person.
what's the penalty in these different cases? Is there a penalty?
On the telephone company?
Yes.
I don't believe I could tell you accurately exactly what the penalty is, but I think the telephone companies and banks and so on understand that they're under severe penalties for violating that requirement. And there are cases when urgency is a factor, and it should be respected just as any exigent circumstances in many other law enforcement contexts. The problem here is that we take the possibility of exigent circumstances as a justification for greatly reducing accountability checks even when there is no urgency. So that's something that could be addressed. I do think that the FISA structure poses a problem because there are a limited number of FISA judges. The number has been expanded since 9/11, but it's still a relatively limited number compared to the district judges that sit around the country. And it's my belief, although I believe this may be classified information, I don't know, I don't have access to it, but my impression is that the FISA court is centralized, sits in Washington. And if that's true, then there is a problem for an agent in Indianapolis to proceed in a timely fashion with a request if it has to go through the FISA court and if it has to get bumped up to Washington. That is a problem. But it seems to me that's a problem in cases of exigent circumstances, and it doesn't justify obliterating checks and balances for those cases that don't require it. Now,
Let me stop you for a second because I'm running out of time. Do you have any idea of about how many times the FBI has used the national security letters since 9/11?
I don't.
Across the country?
I don't.
Do they tell? Does the FBI or Justice Department tell us how many times they've used it? Mr. Thompson, would you know that or?
I don't know what information has been provided to the commission, but I'm almost certain, Congressman, that that information has been provided to the intelligence committees, part of the oversight function.
Okay.
If I could just add one detail here. First of all, I believe that the expanded National Security Letter Authority was enacted within the last month or so by Congress. And part of that enactment appears in the congressional record as a complaint by the intelligence committees that they were not provided information by the Justice Department, and they expressed their understanding that with this, or their hope, that with this expanded authority that the Justice Department would be more forthcoming. I do agree that the definition of financial institution needs to be updated, but nonetheless, part of what's been lumped in there, for example, is access to credit card information, which in my judgment is much broader than the situation really calls for.
Final question, Mr. Thompson, Professor Schulhofer, again, I very much appreciate your insights. I wish you could spend a lot more time with us. You might not want to, but we certainly have benefited from, all your advice and counsel here. A national identification card, would you support that, not support it, have a great deal of concern about it, caveat about it? Mr. Thompson?
I haven't thought a great deal about that, Congressman, so I may want to punt. And
yeah, well, I'll try to catch your punt if you will respond in writing at some point and let me know your thoughts on it.
I would like to just elaborate a little bit about your last question, and that is under the guidelines.
Can I still get your written response
to me? You can
still
get my
Thank you very much.
But I think it's important to point this out, is that under the guidelines that we develop for FBI agents in this area, it's very important to note that these kinds of investigations and these kinds of inquiries that you're talking about with respect to the national security letters cannot be undertaken except for a legitimate counterterrorism investigation for the purpose of detecting terrorist activity. Now, can an FBI agent or can an office short-circuit that? Human nature says that sometimes rules are going to be broken. But if they are broken, there are severe professional consequences to that kind of thing. So we have guidelines, and we have to rely on the professionalism of the overwhelming majority of our law enforcement officials. And they do not undertake these kinds of inquiries lightly, and they do not undertake them to get information about activity that's otherwise protected by the Constitution or by other laws.
Mr. Thompson, very well stated. I wouldn't disagree with anything. My questions have just been targeted at when they've done it, and let's say they've done it in Indianapolis a dozen times. How do we have any kind of judicial review over making sure they don't abuse it? And outside that district, that local office in Indianapolis, is there any kind of review of it, not just judicial review, but any kind of administrative review in the FBI office? I don't know that we have good answers to either one of those questions. A national identification card, once again.
I, too, have not thought through all of the dimensions of that. My intuition has been that the aversion to national identity cards has been a little bit overdrawn. I don't fully understand why there is such an instinctive, relatively widely held public aversion to that idea. I think what we need to be careful about is the information that goes with the national identity card.
So what would it be?
That's the area where I think whether it includes health information, biometric information, social security number. In the world that we're living in now, that kind of information plugs in to what I see over there, maybe from another hearing, the total information awareness. And what we need...
Do you want me to ask you that question
No,
next?
please.
If you'd support that, modify it,
that's easy.
Yeah.
I don't. But what we need to be very clear about if we do have a national identity card is clear structures of accountability and restriction on the use of information. There's a lot of legitimately acquired information that can be used for illegitimate purposes. And we all know that the identity of a covert CIA agent was recently revealed by someone for political purposes. That's the kind of thing that's just the tip of a huge iceberg. So even when the government acquires information legitimately, it's crucial that we have very careful procedures in place that limit the use of that. That's where accountability comes in, and this is where it makes me a little bit sad to hear Larry Thompson, who I respect so much, translate a concern about accountability into questions about into a sense that there are doubts about the professionalism or honesty of our law enforcement officers. To me, that's not what accountability is about. We've had the Fourth Amendment has had for over 200 years the idea that a law enforcement officer's good faith affidavit of need and relevancy is not enough unless an independent judicial mind passes on his belief and on the basis for his belief. That's certainly something that applies in ordinary law enforcement. And it's not because we think the officer is dishonest. It's not because we think he's not professional. It's because we've learned for hundreds of years the importance of having an independent check. And as I mentioned in my testimony, this goes back to George Washington, who was by far the most widely trusted executive in our entire history. And from the very beginning, Washington himself accepted that what he did in the area of executive action would be and should be subject to review by the courts. He didn't take it personally, and I would hope that our people in the executive branch today would be proud of our system that subjects everything that's done to that kind of a check.
Well, I knew I'd get the two of you disagreeing on something after 20 or 25 minutes there. You were very cordial to each other the whole time. I just want to end on your note about General Washington, certainly paraphrasing the widely noted quote about him, first in war, first in peace, but certainly first to establish an intelligence capability for us in this country, which we've read a lot about as members of the Intelligence Committee for several years, and that capability even back 220 years ago. So I want to thank you both again. I know I have lots of colleagues that want to ask both of you questions, and thank you very much for your time once again.
Yeah, we have a number of the commission.